I may need to go up there and help. On the right, there's a bunch of buttons, and one of them might be auto, or on the far right, there's you got it. All right, as long as I'm in it, that's good enough for me. All right, we're going to start with the prayer. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. Help me to see, O Lord, how you are a part of our days, even in the midst of our afflictions. In the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so Judges chapter 2, verses 6 through 23 is where we're going. We looked last week at chapter 1 up through verse 5 of chapter 2. So in chapter 1 of Judges, we had a description of the continuing conquest, the failure to complete the conquest. We saw how Judah tried to work together, but none of the other tribes worked together. And God went from saying, I'm going to drive them out of the land, to now they're going to stay in the land in your midst. And so that's chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, has an angel of the Lord going from Gilgal to Bochim. He said, I brought you up from Egypt. I brought you into this land. I swore to give to your fathers. I said I would never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this that you've done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. And as soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of that place Bochim, which means weepers, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. So this intro is kind of leading us to the setting for the whole book of Judges. Instead of the land being conquested, I don't think that's quite the conquered, there you go, thank you, Al. Instead of the land being conquered, it's now a mixed bag. And then in chapter 2, we're going to hear about the death of Joshua. Now, the death of Joshua had already kind of come up in the first chapter, but here it becomes kind of this hinge to everything again. So we'll start by reading verses 6 through 10. When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. They buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gash, and all the generations also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And then the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods, from among whom the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them. They provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Asteroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers, who plundered them. He sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so they could no longer withstand their enemies. And whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned them, as the Lord had sworn to them, and as they were in terrible distress. All right, so I went further than 10, because I knew I wanted to get into the Baals. So we got this description. He handed them over to the Baals, and then we read about how they, in verse 13, they abandoned the Lord, they served the Baals and the Asteroth. This word Baal is a word that it's got four uses. First word by context is usually the most obvious, and that means to marry. And that's found in Deuteronomy 21. We can read there about how they're given to marriage. Second usage is as a proper noun, outside of a religious context, for an owner, a lord. And there you start to see, kind of in the generic sense, the word Baal will often mean an authority. And so you've got from Exodus 21, owner, an authority figure such as a ruler, a master, or husband. And that's the connection to marriage, that the husband is the lord of the home. The third one is as a generic word meaning Lord. And in fact, the word Baal even gets attached to any god, including Yahweh, the true Lord God. So the word Baal is not immediately, in every context, a bad word. But the context we have here is the one that is most often the one that we have attached to idolatry. And that's as the name for the Canaanite god. And it doesn't always refer to a specific deity in the pantheon of gods in the Canaanite religion. Sometimes when it says they worship the Baals, that's just referring to the lords of the land. Yes, Bill.
Where did the name Baal come from? I mean, is it Greek? Is it Hebrew?
It's Ugaritic. So in the 13th century BC, there's a sound. Is there someone's phone going, or? It's something. All right. He's figuring it out. Okay. We'll get to that. I've got some explanation from that. But so here's in the Canaanite pantheon. So when the Canaanites are specifically thinking about Baal as a specific god, it's the storm god, it's the bringer of rain. And Baal was recognized as the one that brought fertility of crops, animals, and peoples. His followers often believed that sexual acts performed in a temple would boost Baal's sexual prowess. Baal was fertile when rain was flowing. He was not very busy in his fertility activity when there's no rain. And so the idea was you would inspire a heavenly act by doing a physical act in their temples. Somehow this made sense. It works at least once, Al says. We're going to look at one of the first references to Baal and the contact the Israelites have by looking at Numbers chapter 25. So Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 9, says, When Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people are and bowed down. I'm sorry, I don't have my reading glasses right now, so that T and that R looked a lot alike. The people ate and bowed down to their gods, and so Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, Take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger may turn away from Israel. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, Each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose, he left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. Thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. Numbers 25, 1 through 9. And here we'll see Baal of Peor. And so this is Baal with that word maybe Lord or Master and a location. And so sometimes biblical scholars think when you have the name Baal specifically attached to a name, it's referring to the Lord of that place. And you start to get a sense of how people thought of gods in this pagan religion. That every place, every country, every land would have a Lord that would be the guardian of that place. And that, so as you would enter into a land, you would bring your God into battle with the God of that land. And we'll see this also the way the prophets will write, and sometimes, for instance, how the Babylonians, when they took in 586 BC, and they took the stuff from Jerusalem, they brought it into the hall of their God to show that, and their intention was to show that Yahweh was bowing down to the God of Babylon. That's what Babylon was trying to do by bringing the temple things into the hall of their gods. So Baal of Peor would be the idea that there's a god of this land. And as the people arrive in that land, it says they start to whore with the Moabites. And that whoring is not that just an adulterous physical relationship, it's referring to a spiritual adultery. And it brings this sickness on the people. You see this relationship of body and soul. As the soul becomes adulterous, the body becomes weak. And so Numbers 25 is this image. And then we had this image of this Midianite woman. And so one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses, in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel. And so there's this idea here of some sort of, it's strange to think, what does this Midianite woman represent so badly that Eliezer immediately is enraged and brings a spear and pierces through the man and the woman through her belly. It's meant to show us that there is a tremendous jealousy of God for the introduction of falsehood into the people. That God is a jealous God. But it seems remarkably fierce, doesn't it? Let's go with Phyllis first. Yeah, so this man is very publicly bringing it before the people, before Moses, before the whole congregation. So yeah, there's this effort by this man to do something that's smacking against what God has asked for. Now,
Doesn't God give more specific also? Now, what does the two become one in the sexual act?
mm-hmm.
It says, what does branches have to do with prostitutes? Here you've got the same thing with this Midianite. That you've got the same idea. Here you have an Israelite becoming one with wickedness. Is we got to presume the Midianite gal had not converted to know.
Yeah, that's the impression here, that the Midianite is not a friend of God, is not a sojourner in the land, is someone that is attempting to influence and change people's minds. One way this would be described maybe is, this looks remarkably severe, but if your hand causes you to sin, you cut it off. We think of that as metaphorical in the Sermon on the Mount, right? But boom. What we get is, I think in Numbers, a recognition by Phinehas and by the people that see this moment that this is one of the gravest dangers that God's people is going to face. And we also find, if we're thinking that this should become something we should imitate, that when someone comes into our church with a mixed marriage, that we drive a spear through them, don't do that, because first of all, it wasn't successful. I mean, as much as we don't celebrate Phinehas, sure, the plague ended right there, but we have the rest of the Old Testament to show us this didn't answer the issue. God's people still fell into this trap. The spear looked for a moment like the answer, but we saw in the end that our desire for sin is stronger than one spear to this man and this woman. It's going to ultimately take the spear that goes through the Son of God. And so there's some reminder to us, as much as I see the fierceness of Phinehas' jealousy and his desire to protect God, I know that there's more books of God's struggle with his people committing acts of idolatry after that moment in Numbers 25. We're going to look a little bit more now. So under my listing of 4, I said the prophet Samuel. he also struggled with this. And so we're going to look now at 1 Samuel chapter 7. So Samuel is coming as a bridge from the end of the book of Judges to the beginning of the period of Kings. So 1 Samuel is meant to show us essentially how are we going to make it out of this time period of the Judges where this cycle of sin was going on and on and on. And so we had this example of Phinehas with the spear, and now we're going to see how Samuel, a prophet, a priest, doing all of this is trying to help. So 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 2 through 6. Samuel said to all the house of Israel, "If you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Asteroth from among you, and direct your heart to the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines." So the people of Israel put away the Baals and the Asteroth, and they served the Lord only. Then Samuel said, "Gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you." And so they gathered at Mizpah, and drew water, and poured it out before the Lord, and fasted on that day, and said, "We have sinned against the Lord." And Samuel judged the people of Israel at Mizpah. And now when the Philistines heard that the people of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the Lord of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. The people of Israel said to Samuel, "Do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines." So you start to see here a different way to attack Baal and Asteroth. So instead of the spear, what does Samuel do? He just prays, and he asks them. He says, if you want to serve God, serve God. Put away the Baals and Asteroth. And as they start to hear about the Philistines rising up and hearing that all of Israel is at one place, the Philistines think they've got this one-shot opportunity, and the people of Israel say to Samuel, "Please keep praying for us." And so we see Samuel's effort to defeat these false gods is to encourage the people to have a relationship with God. So this is that effort that essentially becomes the carry forward for the rest of the book of Samuel, is worship God, because he desires to have a relationship with you. And then that's where then they say, well, then we need a king. And then we have Saul that comes in after that. Baal worship in Israel doesn't go away with Samuel, though. It sticks around. We're going to look now at 1 Kings chapter 16. So in 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 30 to 31, we're going to see this height of the worship of Baal. And it comes about because of Ahab. So Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. And Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Seguv, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. So Ahab and Jezebel, they introduce Baal with a temple in Samaria, and it says that this is the worst that's ever happened yet. Elijah and the prophets of Baal, they all meet. It's an amazing moment right at Mount Carmel at the height of the plain of Megiddo. And on Wednesday night we were looking at Armageddon. Armageddon is the mountain of Megiddo. It says there's going to be this great battle between the beast and the Lord at Armageddon. Armageddon is Mount Carmel, is the mountain of Megiddo where Elijah and the prophets of Baal had done battle. And so in the book of Revelation, the great battle is that same place of battle that for centuries has been a reminder to the people. Baal will be defeated. And Babylon in Revelation. So now what happens after Elijah? Well, Ahab's son Ahaziah went to consult the god of Baal Zevuv. This is just a good wordplay here. So we're going to look at 2 Kings now, chapter 1. This is where the name Beelzebub comes from. After the death of Ahab, Moab rebelled against Israel. Now Ahaziah fell through the lattice in his upper chamber in Samaria and lay sick. So he sent messengers telling them, "Go inquire, of Baal Zevuv, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover from this sickness." So he's not going to the right God, is he? Baal Zevuv is just a lord of the flies. That's what Baal. So Baal is lord, and Zevuv is like flies, or and later Zevuv becomes the word for a dung heap, because that's where flies are. And so this Beelzebub that we hear about in Mark chapter 3:22, Beelzebub is just Baal Zevuv, the lord of the poop. And so when we think of one of these names of the devil and is a wordplay, is essentially looking at the Lord of flies. And that book, then, we know about what does it look like when you've got this Lord of the Flies book and you've got these boys all in this land. They don't worship the God of mercy and care. They worship Baal, essentially. There's some wordplay that's going on there. Destroying the worship of Baal. This is important. And so 2 Kings chapter 10 becomes a spot where we start to see some silencing of this. And so in 2 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 through 28, Jehu slaughters Ahab's descendants. Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. So Ahab was married to Jezebel, but apparently he was busy elsewhere as well, right? So he's got 70 sons, and the notion is that Ahab's sickness in the land by encouraging worship of Baal is not going to end till his sons stop encouraging this worship. So Jehu tries to bring it to an end. And then so verses 16 through 28 is Jehu striking down the prophets of Baal, Jehu trying to lead Israel back into righteousness. And Jehu is one of those hopeful kings that doesn't quite finish the job as much as you had hoped. That's all Israel. So remember, after King Solomon, Solomon's son Rehoboam and Jeroboam, leader of the 10 northern tribes, Jeroboam and Rehoboam never get along. So Israel is who we've been talking about right now. We're now going to look at what happens with the prophet Baal in Judah, the southern tribes. And unfortunately, the worship of Baal is there as well. There's kind of an alternating that happens. The uprooting of Baal from a place in the culture of Judah did not really successfully take hold until the exile in Babylon. So there is in 2 Chronicles a reference to child sacrifice. So we're going to look at 2 Chronicles 28. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 2 through 3, it says, "But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He even made metal images for the Baals, and he made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his sons as an offering, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. He sacrificed and made offerings on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree." So we start to see this how in Judah, Ahaz is seen as a bad king. Why is he a bad king? Because he didn't walk in the ways of his father David. He walked in the ways of Israel. And it says even to the point of, right? Even to making these metal images, and then sadly, sacrificing his children, his oldest son there, his sons, his plural sons. Chapter 33, verse 6, we see more of this in verse 6. And he burned his sons as an offering in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and used fortune-telling and omens and sorcery, and dealt with mediums and necromancers. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Baal here, the god Moloch, false god of the Moabites, was also seen as a god that was placated with his anger. Moloch was seen as a god of thunder, and that this god would bring less, you could bring storms, but not dangerous thunder by sacrificing to this. This all sounds very pagan and very old and something that doesn't happen anymore. But the god of Baal, this false god, is built in this model, and this model still exists. Transaction. God, if I give you this, you'll give me that. And the definition that God is always seeking to have with his people is covenant. I promise this. Have faith in me. And the contrast to a covenantal relationship is a transactional relationship. And this is the pagan model that unfortunately still exists to anyone that's trying to manipulate God to get what we want. And so as we look at Baal, and you think this is so old, this is so ancient, who does this? Who sacrifices their kids? But there is still this transactional faith that happens. The name Baal, just last paragraph now on here. The name Baal is found in the Old Testament as singular, as plural, with various titles, places, and people. Now, Bill's question, how do we know about Baal? Here's the reality. This whole thing I told you about the temple worship and the inspiring of Baal to send right by having these temple sexual things, that's only kind of alluded to in the Bible. But we have these Ugaritic texts. There's a collection of tablets that have cuneiform on them. Cuneiform was an ancient form of writing where you would have a soft clay tablet, and then you would press into that clay tablet a series of shapes. And those shapes were either going to be more like whole words, like you might have, say, in Chinese, or then that same cuneiform method later on became more a phonetic spelling. But phonetic spelling comes a little bit later. Phonetic spelling, I mean there, where you take a series of these symbols and they form the sound of letters. So in this cuneiform writing from the 13th and 12th century, these tablets, they weren't discovered until 1928. And the finding of these tablets in the 20th century incredibly increased our understanding of the Canaanite pantheon of gods. And in there is this story. It's called the Baal cycle. It includes Baal battling other gods in order to bring about the fertility of the land. And then at the end of the Baal cycle, Baal dies at the hand of the god Mot, which for those who like Indo-European languages, Mot is rooted in Indo-European word for death. And so the god Mot brings the death to Baal, and it's the death of the harvest season. It's the end of the season. But Baal is reborn as the people are inspired and awaken him, and there you have another seasonal year of farming. So this Baal cycle, which is very mythic, as people are reading these tablets, what they think it is essentially a farmer's almanac, a way to know the seasons. And the seasons that we experience here on earth in this Baal cycle are just simply representative of what truly is going on in the spiritual world. So before these Baal tablets were found in 1928, we didn't know a lot of this fertility stuff about Baal. We just knew Baal was in the Old Testament. And then we started to learn more and more about why were they so attached to Baal. Howard. This is true. And so in Mexico, the way the Mayans would use their gods to understand the seasons, and in Africa as well, where there were a lot of pagan practices before Christian missionaries had arrived there, this was also seen there. It seems to be, even in New Guinea, it seems to be a basic pattern of any religion that doesn't have a covenantal relationship with God will slide into this, trying to understand this world by creating a mythical narrative that becomes a narrative we can control and understand. So I went through this whole excursus about Baal for this reason. Baal comes up a lot in the Old Testament. And Baal sometimes is going to refer to a very specific Canaanite god in the pantheon of gods. But often it's just a placeholder for that falseness that exists, where you make the Lord of that land rather than Lord of Lords, where you make this fertility that you are seeking something that you can manipulate. Now, you also heard next to Baal this word Asteroth. Asteroth is seen as the consort of Baal, the female deity. And so there would be in ancient digs, and you could go to the DIA and you'll see examples of this, but you'll see these little tiny things, and they're just very heavily breasted women. That would be the Astarte. And so the idea would be you'd have Baal and you would have that Asteroth and together. And that's one of the reasons why we start to think there's, this fertility and this sexual immorality that's happening, just because of the way these false little pagan deities looked in their modeling. The reason to look at all of this is to start to say, why do the people of Israel leave the covenantal relationship that they have with God, where God makes a promise and the people are asked to believe that promise, and they go towards these pagan gods? Why do you think that slide happens? Yeah.
We wanted to do something about the
Mm-hmm.
decision theology. Covenantal relationship. God's doing everything. We're acknowledging we're nothing without Him.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of grates on our ego, our self-awareness.
Yeah, so Al made the point that we want to do something. We want to be active. And a covenantal relationship is asking you to believe God is doing something. It's hard to wait. Didi.
We also don't like His rules.
Mm-hmm.
Create our own that are good for us.
Yeah, God's covenant relationship is bounded by His commandments. And if I don't like those, then I'm going to write my own. Yeah. This whole idea is if you don't like the story, write your own story. Well, what happens if the story that you want to write is one that's pretty selfish? This whole positive inspiration is built on the inherent trust that people ultimately are good. What do you do when the reality is something other than that? That's where a parent's got to be a parent. So this slide into Baal is arriving because the people are struggling to trust in God. When are moments that you think the people will struggle to trust in God? What will be an example of a time that may arrive where you would say, it's hard to trust God right now. I need to do something. When you're praying for something and it doesn't come, then you want to do something else. Okay. Howard. Yeah, during the pandemic, there's this great spiritual awakening that could happen, but there's also tremendous division and conflict. And the idea is, I don't want to wait for an answer. I'm going to research it. I'm going to find my own answer. And there is some personal responsibility to figure out what's going on. There's a difference between personal responsibility of learning an issue versus thinking I can change the issue. Yeah, it's a tough thing. Anytime something that happens that seems out of my desire, that's when I want a false God that can do what I want, rather than a God who says, trust me. We're going to now look at some questions on our sheet that are going to get through the verses we read in 1 through 15. So kind of setting aside this talk of Baal, we're now going to look a little bit more specifically at the verses that we read. And our first question is about Joshua and the elders. It says, Joshua and the elders walked with the Lord. What role did Joshua have in Israel's history? You take the grand scheme of Israel's history, and someone said, what difference did Joshua make? Why did he exist in the story? What's his role? This is a character plot. What is Joshua? Yeah, Barb. Yeah. So he's the leader, the guide that brings the waiting to an end and arrival happens. Okay. How else would you describe Joshua? For many of the families, they didn't know Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, and even Moses becomes this guy of the past. Joshua's their father. He's the one that gathered them. When he called them together, they came. Mm-hmm.
He's the guy that brings the rough and Sinai.
Yeah.
That Aaron and Moses blow it big time. Joshua's there the whole time. But apparently he's faithful in the background sometimes.
So Joshua remains a faithful servant of God. Even when he and Caleb went on their spy mission, they were the two that came back saying, we can do this. With God, we can do this. Certainly, I mean, there's the commonality of name. Jesus and Joshua are the same Hebrew name. Thinking about your own families now, is there someone in your family that has this role? It is often the case that there is, in families, a leader, a guide, that one that rallies the troops and brings people to the destination. And then there might be a next generation after that's going to struggle. And so some families are in the midst of that Joshua, they've got it. Some families are a generation after Joshua, and they're really kind of wishing things would be better. In your families, can you think of someone that might serve that role of a Joshua? Maybe it's you. Maybe you're supposed to be that head of the household that brings people out of wilderness towards the promise. We all are bishops in our homes. Question 2. The people followed God while Joshua and the elders were alive, but then turned away after they died. I forgot to write the question. Why? Why does that happen? Why does the generation after Joshua and the elders struggle? There is, in verse 10, an answer. Well, it's not quite an answer, but it's maybe an explanation. So Judges chapter 2, verse 10. So Judges chapter 2, verse 10. What does it say about that next generation? They did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel. Remember how the Ten Commandments are introduced by God? When God gives them to Moses, he says, I am the Lord your God, the one who brought you out of Egypt. So the Ten Commandments were always introduced with this is God and this is God's work. You divorce the Ten Commandments from that activity of God, and the Ten Commandments now just become just a bunch of rules and not an explanation of how God desires you to live with knowledge of him and his work. 3, children today continue to grow up in Christian families and follow God while their parents are around. People who follow God are around with their believing friends, but not alone or around their unbelieving friends. What makes it hard to follow God when someone is around the unbeliever? So you got this imaginary person. Bob is with his mom and dad. He worships God and is a friend of God. He's around his believing friends and everything's going right. He's now distant from his family and he's around his unbelieving friends. He finds it harder to worship God. Why does it get hard? Doesn't have a faith of his own. Yeah. Yeah, the temptations around the world are more attractive when you don't have someone reminding you that's dangerous. Howard, what do you see? The college environment is incredibly hard. That's right. All right, so question 4, how may the church help support the sharing of faith from one generation to the next? What can we do so that this moment of a new generation arose that did not know the Lord or his works? What can we do to stop that moment? We teach. We teach the faith. We share the faith, and we do so without just rules detached from God. But we make sure people know God and they know God's work. When people think of Christianity and they think of it as rules, that's something that's not very attractive, yeah. I've mentioned this before. Tim Keller, in his book, A Reason for God, an Age of Reason. So it's The Reason for Faith in the Age of Reason, I think. The name is escaping me. I've got the cover in my mind. Anyways, in the introduction, Tim Keller says that there are 3 barriers common to why many people become detached from their faith. First one is intellectual. They just have not been given the tools to understand their faith in such a way that they can adequately understand what their opponents are saying and come back to their opponents with apologetics. We keep people's faith too infantile. And we don't equip them to know the intellectual reasons why to believe. The second one, I'll go through all 3, and then and the second one he says is personal. That we create this artificial thing that says you have to have it in your heart, and you have to feel it. And if you don't feel it, you don't have it yet. And he said, when I went to college, I didn't feel much in my heart about it, so I thought I didn't have it. And so he said, we have to be careful about how we describe faith as so much of an emotional thing that when someone feels distant from it, they think they're absent from God. He said, personal faith, how do we describe someone who has faith? He said, if we make it emotional, not everyone has that. And so we drive them away because we essentially convince them they don't have it. The third one he says is social. We are communal people. We need to believe that if I believe this, I will have friends. I won't be alone. He says, but when I went to college, I struggled to find people who loved God and who were nice. The people I met in college who loved God were kind of jerks. So I thought that if I wanted to be a nice person, I had to leave God. That's his experience, and I find it, unfortunately, what he's describing is a common set of barriers. Now, someone might be more inside of one barrier or another, but those were the 3 barriers he described to how we share the faith from one generation to the next. Howard. Yeah, so Charles Wesley described the stool that has 3 legs on it, and talking about what was it? Knowledge, reason. I can't remember them all, but that's kind of what he wanted to do in the awakening that the Methodist Church was supposed to be bringing, is equipping them to sit on all 3 legs. All right, we can't answer all the questions for why one generation fails, but you start to see in the book of Judges what happens when a new generation arises. They get caught in a bad spiral. In Joshua 2:11 through 15, why did the people turn to idol worship? I think when we were talking about the Baals, we got kind of into that. What kind of things does peer pressure or culture tempt believers with? What do you think right now culture's greatest temptation is? Okay, so rely on someone else. All right. Self-reliance. There's also this, you don't need anybody else. You don't need community. You don't need God. You can do it yourself. So it's interesting. You came both up with separate polls. What's another great pressure of culture today? Howard, what do you see? All right, so this idea of someone else can fix the problem. Okay. Terry? Everybody becomes their own God. Everyone becomes their own judge, jury, and executor. Yeah. Yeah, there's a few trolls out there in the world. So what happens to Israel because of their disobedience? What does Israel face when they disobey God? Does God say, that's fine? God gets angry, he gets jealous, he punishes them, and he lets them know that things are dangerous. Final question we're going to handle today, and then we'll pick up this study 16 through 18, and the remainder of the book of chapter 2 next week. Why would the hand of the Lord be against the people he called into the promised land? So when the people are disobedient against God, God stretches out his hand of judgment against them, hands them over to their enemies. Why would God do that to the very people he has brought into the promised land? To bring them back, to spiritually bring them back. So physically they might be in the land, but spiritually they're getting too far away. So he wants them to show the danger of getting far away from him. Now, why else does God bring his angry eyes on?
This stuff is real, people.
Yeah.
I said, well, this is what I'm showing you in the covenant. And if you're not in the covenant, this is what you're in the covenant, so you may. Oh, if you're not in the covenant, remember it's a God and be.
So Al's making the point, it's not just academic. God is saying this is real stuff that I'm talking about. I want you to be with me in reality. And if you're without me, I'm going to let you look at what life without me looks like. All right, we're going to end there. Let's close with our prayer. O Lord, grant us a rhythm of repentance and forgiveness in our day-to-day lives, and grant us sincerity and faith in Christ. Give us this wisdom now to share this faith not just for ourselves, but with the next generation. In the name of Jesus, amen. All right. Todd, can you help me out and go to that computer, and in that live stream software, in the bottom right, there's going to be a button that says Stop Stream.